She stood barefoot in the rain, belly swollen, rope burning her palms as she dragged a panicked calf from a raging ravine. Mud clung to her like judgment. Lightning lit the horror in Walter's eyes. But she didn't stop, not even when the earth gave way beneath her knees. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. May's steps across the hard-packed dirt rang louder than they should have, barefoot on soil that had forgotten the rains. The ranch stretched wide and open behind her, a place where wind cut across the prairie like a whisper of old judgment. The bunkhouse door creaked as she opened it, one room, plain, with a potbelly stove in the corner and a cot against the far wall. Dust stirred in the golden light slanting through the window. The air smelled faintly of tobacco and old timber. It was not comfort, not by any measure, but it was hers, for a week. She set down her bag with care. Inside, a Bible, a bundle of baby clothes yellowed with time, a letter never sent, and 2 hand-stitched quilt squares. One bore a tulip, the other a crooked heart. Both had once been part of a larger whole, something warm, something broken now. May rolled up her sleeves and went straight to the wash basin. The pump groaned but yielded water. She scrubbed her arms and face, wiped down the windowsill, swept out cobwebs from the corners with a borrowed broom. She did it not from hope of approval, but from instinct. Her dignity lived in clean linens and scrubbed floors, not in another's opinion. Outside, the sun lowered itself slowly, bathing the land in amber. Walter worked in silence near the corral, moving hay bales with slow, practiced strength. She watched him from the window for a moment. How he moved like someone who had once carried more than he could bear and simply got used to the weight. By dusk, she'd built a small fire in the stove and boiled potatoes left in a paper sack on the floor. She peeled and mashed them with butter, then roasted 2 thin slices of salt pork she found hanging in a smoked bag. She brought the plate to the main house without being asked. Walter opened the door and blinked at her. She said nothing, just handed him the food. He didn't say thank you. But the next morning, when she stepped outside, the old boots by the porch were gone. In their place sat a pair of men's socks, thick wool, worn but dry and clean. May stared at them for a long while. Then she slipped them on and walked toward the barn, the frost crunching under her steps. Her back was straight, her breath steady. She would earn her place here, not by demand, but by doing what she always had, enduring. The town of Maple Hollow wasn't large, but its silences could stretch wide and deep, filled with looks more cutting than words, with smiles too tight to be kind. By the 3rd day, May Harmon had already been measured and found wanting by the women behind the dry goods counter, by the boys loitering near the mill, and by the sharp-eyed matron who ran the church sewing circle like a battlefield infirmary. A stranger, barefoot, heavy with child, and living under a man's roof? No need to ask, only to assume. The worst of it came not in the words, but in the half-spoken sentences. "A shame, really," said one. "With the baby and all," muttered another. "There's charity, and then there's foolishness." May didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the barrel of flour she hoisted into the cart herself. Walter had loaned her the wagon, but no mule. That she'd walk it back didn't seem to trouble him, and she wouldn't give anyone the pleasure of seeing her struggle. Inside the mercantile, the air smelled of cloves, lamp oil, and judgment. The preacher's wife, pale and pinched as a linen napkin, leaned across the counter and addressed no one in particular. "There are places for women like that," she said sweetly, "but this town isn't one of them." May's hands trembled only slightly as she counted out coins. Pennies earned mending Walter's shirts and scrubbing the soot from his stovepipe. She placed them one by one on the counter. Then she lifted the flour sack onto her shoulder and turned without speaking. Back at the bunkhouse, night fell like a lid. The wind had teeth, and the walls, though thick, whispered every gust. May sat under the lantern's flicker, stitching the shoulder seam of one of Walter's older shirts. Her stitches were precise, patient, never rushed. Her mother once said a woman's hands carried more truth than her tongue. May had tried to live by that. When Walter's boots scraped the porch, she didn't look up. His voice came low from the doorway, the edge dulled but not softened. "They shouldn't speak to you like that," he said. "But it's a small town. You can't expect—" "I don't expect anything," she said, not bitter, not meek, just honest. "I've lived too long on what others think of me." There was a long pause, and when she finally looked up, his eyes were already on her. Not on her belly, not on her calloused feet, but on her. There was something in his gaze she hadn't seen in any man in years. Recognition. Not as a burden, but as someone still standing. He didn't speak again that night, but the silence between them shifted. No longer heavy, just waiting. Morning light spilled through the warped slats of the bunkhouse, soft and slanted like a memory trying to break through. May woke early, before the rooster, before the prairie winds stirred the dust. She'd taken to stitching by the window, half an hour of quiet needlework before the day swallowed her whole. Each thread was a line in a story no one asked to hear, but she told it anyway, in pieced fabrics and flour-dusted counters. The bunkhouse had changed, not drastically, not all at once, but it no longer felt like a shelter for the temporary. The cot was layered now, old quilt over newer one, both patterned with faded tulips and bold stars. Curtains hung from bent nails, hand-sewn with strips of flour sack and edged in lace she'd found in a tin under the bed. There were sprigs of rosemary drying on the windowsill and a chipped mug full of wildflowers on the washstand. Outside, May moved with practiced rhythm. She shoveled stalls, brushed down the horses, and laid kindling beneath the cook-stove before the sun crested the hills. Her hands bore small cuts and stains, her sleeves patched again and again. But there was pride in the quiet repetition of her tasks, work that mended something deeper than broken seams. Walter noticed. Not with praise, he wasn't a man of easy words, but with presence. He lingered after supper, sipping slowly from his coffee while she wiped down the table. Once he brought her a new spool of thread from town wrapped in brown paper. No explanation, just placed it beside her plate and sat down. That night, his boots remained by the door long after the dishes were clean. They didn't speak much of the past, but one evening over stew and cornbread, he asked, voice low and uncertain, "What was he like? The father?" May set down her spoon. He smiled for others and scowled at home. He was careful about it. Never bruises on the face, never raised his voice in public. But he made me small. Every day, a little smaller. Her fingers traced the edge of her bowl. "I chose to leave because I want my child to grow up knowing that fear isn't love, that kindness isn't weakness." Walter nodded, once, and never asked again. Then came the night of the storm. Thunder rolled like hooves across the sky. When the call came about the calf in the ravine, May didn't hesitate. She grabbed a rope, lit the lantern, and bolted into the dark. Mud sucked at her steps. Rain sheeted sideways. The calf bleated, panicked and trembling. May dropped to her knees, crawling forward, voice steady and soft as she looped the rope around its neck. She braced her legs against the earth, pulled with everything left in her, gritting through pain, fear, and cold. Walter arrived breathless, slipping down beside her, but the calf was already safe. May had done it. They stood soaked, shoulder to shoulder, beneath a sky cracking with light. He looked at her, as if truly seeing her for the first time. "You ever think about staying?" he asked. May didn't speak. She looked toward the barn where her garden fought its way from the earth, stubborn and sure. In the center, thin, wind-bent but still standing, was the first green bud of a rose. The evening of the harvest social was warm in the way only a prairie spring could be, earth rich with thaw, air soft as a sigh. Lanterns swung from tree limbs and the barn rafters, their golden halos catching motes of dust and laughter. Music hummed from fiddle and banjo, old songs stitched together by memory and miles. The townsfolk wore their Sunday best, but it was a quiet sort of pride that filled the air, not grandeur. Shoes were scuffed, hems mended, and smiles gentle. The land didn't breed spectacle, it shaped endurance. May stood just outside the light at first, her hands clasped together in front of her. The second-hand dress from Widow Ellison hugged her figure gently, high-waisted to leave room for the child soon to come. The fabric bore faint, sun-faded roses, barely visible unless you looked close. May had reinforced each seam with small, invisible stitches. She always mended quietly, thoroughly, like she was piecing herself back together. When Walter offered his arm, there was no flourish. Just a simple nod and a question in his eyes. She laid her hand lightly in the crook of his elbow. Around them, the music played on. They danced, slow and unadorned, not in the center of the floor, but near the edge, where the shadows softened things. His steps were careful, hers instinctive. Neither spoke. There was no need. Silence had become their second language. People watched. The same people who once crossed the street to avoid her gaze now nodded, half ashamed, half curious. But May didn't see them. Not really. Her smile wasn't for them. It came from someplace deeper, the way the sun warms stone after long frost. It was the smile of someone who'd been broken open, mended herself and chosen to stand in the light anyway. Later, as the crowd thinned and fireflies blinked between fence posts, Walter guided her away from the dance floor. They walked to the back of the barn where the music was no more than a distant echo. He reached behind him and brought out a bundle, worn but clean. A quilt, unfinished but vibrant. Sky blue, pale yellow, faded red, the same colors she'd tucked away months before. "I found your patchwork scraps behind the stove," he said, his voice rough with meaning. "Figured you might like to finish this with me." May's breath caught. Her hand rose slowly, fingers trembling as they traced the familiar stitches. "You saw me?" she whispered. "I did," Walter said. "Took me a while, but I see you now." They stood there. No kiss, no grand gesture. Just the quilt held between them, the moon shining down, and the scent of prairie grass rising all around. In the garden behind the barn, beneath the wide sky, the rose she had planted months ago had opened, full, bold, and impossibly red.